Welcome back for another deep dive. You guys really threw down the gauntlet this time with all this material on Buddhist philosophy.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to try to tackle conditioned origination,
Okay.
specifically the 12 Nidanas.
Right.
And some of these texts are
Yeah.
pretty dense, like these excerpts from the Yogacara Abhidharma.
Right.
But that's what we do here, right?
That's what we're here for, yeah.
Unearth the gems and connect the dots.
I think what's really interesting about this set of texts in particular is that we see a kind of early Buddhism evolving,
Right.
and we see
It's a snapshot in time.
it's a snapshot in time of how they're thinking about rebirth and consciousness.
So before we get too far, I think it would be good to get everybody on the same page.
Yeah.
The 12 Nidanas, just in a nutshell, is a sequence of causes and effects,
Right.
almost like a chain reaction
Yes.
that explains how we get caught in the cycle of suffering and rebirth.
Exactly. Each link in the chain leads to the next one. So there's this continuous cycle. And one of the first things that you notice when you start digging into these texts is that there's this debate about whether the Nidanas play out over 2 or 3 lifetimes.
Yeah, the Yogacara Abhidharma texts actually present arguments for both sides.
Right.
Some scholars argue that it's a 3-lifetime process
Yeah.
where actions in a past life create the conditions for rebirth in the present life, which then sets the stage for a future life.
It's like this really intricate ripple effect through time.
Yeah.
Almost like a cause that's influencing multiple lives.
Right. And then there's the other side of the debate that suggests a 2-lifetime model.
Right.
And you find that viewpoint in some commentaries on the Abhidharma.
Yes.
So how do they reconcile these two seemingly contradictory viewpoints?
Yeah. So this is where the idea of relative time comes in.
Okay.
The Yogacara Abhidharma texts actually explain that our understanding of past, present, and future lifetimes
Okay.
changes depending on where we are in the chain. What might look like a past life from one perspective could be considered the present life from a different point in the sequence.
Wow, that's pretty mind-bending.
Yeah,
So our perception of time is tied to our vantage point in the chain.
totally.
I'm curious for you, when you think about these nidanas spanning multiple lifetimes, does this make this ancient concept feel more or less relevant to your own life today?
Oh, that's such a great question.
It's something to think about as we kind of explore how these ideas have shaped Buddhist philosophy over time.
Absolutely. And speaking of ideas that evolve, the concept of consciousness, or vijñāna,
Okay.
is a particularly intriguing one.
Right.
And these Yogacara Abhidharma texts give a unique perspective on vijñāna, especially in the context of the 12 Nidanas.
So we're going beyond just the basic 5 senses here.
Exactly.
Come in.
Consciousness is not just about sensory experience.
Okay.
It's depicted as something much more dynamic.
Right.
It carries within it the seeds of future rebirth,
Interesting.
almost like a blueprint that shapes future experiences.
So it's not just about what we experience through our senses in this life,
Right.
but also the potential for future experiences carried within our consciousness.
Precisely. And what makes the Yogacara Abhidharma texts even more fascinating is that they represent a snapshot of Buddhist thought
Right.
before the fully developed idea of a storehouse consciousness,
Okay.
the alayavijñāna that appears in later Yogacara teachings.
Gotcha.
It's like we're seeing a theory in its very early stages.
Like sometimes you go to a museum and you'll see early drafts of a famous novel.
Oh, yeah.
And you can see how they got to the final version, but it's really cool to see their thought process.
Totally.
So this is really like that
The treasure
trove of seeing how these early Buddhist thinkers were working with these ideas.
It is. And this evolving concept of consciousness is really tied to the idea of karmic seeds, or bija.
Right.
And this brings us to our next point,
Okay.
the power of sanskaras.
Okay, so remind us, what are sanskaras again?
Sanskaras are often translated as karmic formations. They're like these imprints left on our consciousness by our actions,
Okay.
both in this life and in previous lives.
Right.
And what the Abhidharma really emphasizes is how these sanskaras are what embed those karmic seeds,
Okay.
the bija,
Gotcha.
into our consciousness. So it's like every action we take, every thought we have leaves a tiny little imprint.
Yeah.
And those imprints shape our experience and tendencies.
That's a great way to think about it.
Almost like we're carrying around this invisible luggage from our past
Absolutely.
that's influencing our present.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, what luggage are we carrying that we're not even aware of,
Right.
right? Think about habits or tendencies you feel you were just born with.
Right.
Could these be echoes of those past karmic seeds at work?
Interesting.
Now, we're going to explore this concept of sparsha, which is often translated as contact.
Okay.
But as you'll see, there's a lot more to it than meets the eye.
I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
It seems like even the simplest concepts in Buddhist philosophy have these hidden depths. Absolutely. The Sarvastivadin school, for example, sees sparsha as a real separate element.
Okay.
It's not just the act of touching,
Right.
but a distinct element that arises from the meeting of a sense organ, its object in consciousness.
So if I were to touch this table right here,
Yeah.
sparsha wouldn't just be the feeling of my hand on the wood. It would be an independent element arising from that.
That's how the Sarvastivadins would see it. But the Dardantikas, another school of thought, have a different perspective.
Okay.
They argue that sparsha isn't a separate element at all.
Okay.
It's simply the convergence of the sense organ, its object in consciousness.
So two very different ways of looking at how we interact with the world around us.
Totally.
Where does the Abhidharmakosha land on this debate?
So the Abhidharmakosha actually offers a kind of middle path.
Okay.
It defines sparsha as the distinct apprehension
Okay.
of the organ's modification. It's not just the physical contact, but the awareness of how that contact changes the sense organ.
So not just the object touching our sense organ, but how our mind interprets that contact.
Precisely.
Seems like this interpretation is drawing on those Yogacara ideas about the role of consciousness.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this deeper understanding of contact has some really interesting implications for how we understand our interactions with the world.
Yeah.
What does it mean to truly contact something
Right.
if that contact is shaped by our perceptions and interpretations?
Interesting.
It's a question worth considering as we move into our next topic, which is all about pleasure
All right.
and whether it can truly exist in a world marked by impermanence and suffering.
Now that's a question I think we can all relate to.
Yeah,
Everybody wants to experience pleasure,
of course.
but Buddhist teachings often remind us that attachment to pleasure can lead to suffering.
Right.
So I'm really curious to see how these texts unpack that paradox.
Me too. It is a paradox, isn't it? I mean, the pursuit of pleasure is so fundamental to our experience,
Right.
and yet Buddhist teachings warn us about it.
Right. Are we supposed to avoid pleasure?
Yeah, like how do we deal with that?
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a lot of fun.
No, it's not about denying ourselves pleasure.
Okay.
It's more about understanding its true nature
Right.
and shifting our relationship to it.
Okay.
We were talking earlier about impermanence.
Right.
That applies to pleasure too.
Okay, so like enjoying a beautiful sunset or a delicious meal,
Yes.
that's fine as long as we don't get attached.
Exactly. The problem arises when we make our happiness dependent on those things
Yeah.
because they're impermanent. That dependence leads to suffering when they fade away.
Right. Like clinging to those things is what causes the problem, not the pleasure itself.
Yeah, it's like admiring a beautiful flower
Right.
without picking it and trying to keep it forever.
Yeah.
You can enjoy its beauty without possessing it.
I like that analogy.
And this brings us back to the sutta debate that we touched on earlier.
Okay.
Some Buddhist teachers actually argue that all feeling even pleasure is ultimately dukkha, suffering.
Yeah. That seems a bit extreme.
I know. It's a tough one to wrap your head around,
Yeah.
especially since sukha is often translated as pleasure.
Right.
What's really fascinating is that Vasubandhu in the Abhidharmakosha actually presents this nuanced defense of sukha.
Okay.
He argues that it is a distinct experience from dukkha
Okay.
while also acknowledging that it is impermanent.
So he's saying pleasure exists.
Yeah.
But it can still lead to suffering.
Yeah, it's a both-hand kind of situation.
Okay.
And he argues that recognizing the impermanent nature of pleasure is actually what allows us to experience it more fully.
So by letting go, we can actually enjoy it more.
Exactly. By letting go of our clinging and craving, we can appreciate the experience for what it is in the moment.
Right. So it's that this too shall pass idea
Yeah,
applies to the good times as well.
totally. And it allows us to savor the experience even more.
Okay, so I'm starting to understand the nuance here.
Yeah.
But how does this all relate back to the 12 nidanas? We were talking about consciousness carrying karmic seeds from one life to the next.
Yes.
So where does pleasure and suffering fit into that?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
It brings us to one of the most mind-boggling aspects of the 12 nidanas.
Right.
The idea that our experiences in this life,
Yeah.
including our experiences of pleasure and suffering,
Right.
plant the seeds for future rebirth.
So if we experience a lot of pleasure in this life, we're more likely to be reborn into a pleasurable existence in the next life.
Well, it's not quite as simple as a direct correlation,
Okay.
but our actions, thoughts, and intentions,
Okay.
all shaped by our experiences of pleasure and suffering,
Yeah.
create karmic traces that shape the conditions of our future lives.
So it's not about seeking specific rewards or punishments.
Right.
It's more about understanding the long-term impact of our choices.
Exactly. And this is where the concept of karmic seeds, or bija,
Right.
really comes into play. The Yogacara Abhidharma texts suggest that these karmic seeds are embedded within the very fabric of consciousness. They're not physical things.
Right.
They're more like potentials or tendencies
Okay.
carried within that stream of consciousness.
So when we die, our physical body dissolves, but the stream of consciousness with those seeds continues.
That's the idea, and those seeds then become the blueprint for a new life, shaping the conditions of our rebirth.
It's a lot to think about,
It is.
but it really highlights how interconnected everything is.
It does.
And that our actions have consequences that ripple out beyond just our present moment.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that interconnectedness is a recurring theme in Buddhist philosophy.
Right.
Now, I do want to mention something interesting about these Yogacara Abhidharma texts.
Okay.
Remember how we were talking about that storehouse consciousness?
Right, the alayavijñāna.
Yes,
Yeah.
the alayavijñāna.
Yeah.
You won't find any mention of it in these texts.
Interesting. So they're saying it doesn't exist?
Not necessarily. It's more that we're seeing an earlier stage of Yogacara thought here,
Right.
before that idea was fully developed.
Gotcha. So it's like peeking behind the curtain,
Yeah.
seeing how these ideas were developing.
Okay.
Gives us a valuable historical perspective
It does.
to see how these complex philosophical concepts were refined and elaborated on over time.
Absolutely. It's like having access to those rough drafts of a masterpiece.
Exactly.
And speaking of evolving concepts, let's revisit the six senses for a moment.
Okay.
We touched on them earlier,
Right.
but they take on a deeper meaning within the context of the 12 nidanas.
Okay, so we're talking sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch, and mind.
Yes.
How do they contribute to this chain of causation that leads to suffering?
Well, think about it.
Okay.
Our senses are constantly bombarded with stimuli from the external world.
Right.
Sights, sounds, smells, tastes, physical sensations.
Yeah.
It creates this never-ending stream of experiences that can easily pull us away from the present moment and into this cycle of craving and aversion.
We get hooked by the pleasant ones
Yes.
and repulsed by the unpleasant ones.
Thanks
So
for
we're
that.
constantly chasing and running away.
Yeah, and that chasing after sensory experience is a key part of how we create our own suffering. It's not that the senses themselves are bad.
Right.
It's how we relate to them that determines whether they become a source of suffering or a doorway to liberation.
That makes sense. So how do we break free from that trap?
This is where the practices of mindfulness and meditation become so important.
Okay.
They help us cultivate a different relationship with our senses,
Okay.
one that is characterized by awareness and equanimity.
So instead of being swept away by every sensory experience, we learn to observe them without judgment.
Precisely.
Okay.
Recognize their impermanent nature
Yeah.
and our own capacity to choose how we respond.
So we're learning to watch the movie
Yeah.
of our sensory experience without getting lost in the plot.
That's a great way to put it.
But what happens when that movie inevitably includes scenes of contact,
Yeah.
of our senses coming into contact with the world?
Right.
That's where sparsha comes in, right?
Exactly. Contact is inevitable.
Yeah.
We can't experience the world without our senses coming into contact with it.
Right. And there are all these different interpretations of sparsha.
Yes.
Is it an element or a process?
Right.
Yeah.
The Sarvastivadins see it as a real separate element.
Right. Yeah.
The Dadantikas argue it's more of a process.
Yeah.
And the Abhidhammakosha, influenced by Yogacara ideas, offers that interesting middle path,
Right.
defining sparsha as the distinct apprehension of the organ's modification.
Right. So it's not just the physical act of touching, but how our mind interprets that contact.
Exactly. And that meaning-making is what fuels the next link in the chain of the 12 nidanas, feeling or vedana.
Okay.
This is where our experience of contact starts to get colored by our emotional responses.
So Vedana is about how we react to those sensory experiences.
Yes.
Whether we experience them as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral.
Precisely. And here's where things get really important in terms of understanding the cycle of suffering.
Okay.
Because if we react to every sensory experience with craving or aversion, we just perpetuate the cycle.
It's like we're getting hooked by those pleasant feelings and repulsed by the unpleasant ones.
Yes.
Which keeps us constantly chasing and running away,
Exactly.
never finding any peace.
And this is why Buddhist teachings emphasize the importance of cultivating equanimity,
Okay.
the ability to experience all feelings without being swept away by them.
So it's not about suppressing our feelings,
Right.
but learning to observe them without judgment.
Precisely.
recognizing that they are impermanent
Yes.
and don't define who we are.
Exactly. And that understanding of feeling as impermanent and not self
Okay.
is key to breaking free from that chain of causation.
So we can experience the full spectrum of human emotions without getting caught in the trap.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've explored contact and feeling. What comes next in this intricate dance of the 12 nidanas?
Well, after feeling comes craving, or toltang.
Okay.
And this is where things can get really tricky.
All right, how so?
Because once craving enters the picture, it's like this powerful force
Okay.
driving us to seek out what we desire
Right.
and avoid what we dislike.
So it's like that feeling of thirst that can never be quenched.
That's a good analogy because craving, in the Buddhist sense, goes beyond just physical desires.
Right.
It encompasses this longing for pleasurable experiences,
Okay.
material possessions, recognition, status, even the continuation of our own existence.
It sounds exhausting.
It is. It's exhausting.
Constantly chasing.
Yeah, and that's the point. The 12 nidanas show us how this cycle of craving
Right.
keeps us trapped
Yeah.
in this state of dissatisfaction.
Right. Nothing can ultimately quench that thirst.
Exactly, because everything is impermanent and constantly changing.
Right. So how do we escape the clutches of craving?
That's the central question of Buddhist practice. And it's not about erasing all desire. It's about gradually weakening the grip of craving through mindfulness, meditation, and ethical conduct.
So it's about changing how we relate to our desires.
Yes.
Recognizing their true nature.
Exactly.
Seeing through the illusions that fuel them.
It's like realizing we've been chasing mirages in the desert.
I like that.
And as that craving diminishes, it loosens its grip on the next link in the chain, clinging, or upadana.
So clinging is like craving's even more intense older sibling.
You could say
Okay.
that clinging is the act of grasping onto those things we crave,
Right.
whether it's an experience, a possession, a relationship, or even our own identity. It's this desperate attempt to hold on to something that's ultimately impermanent.
Yeah, which just causes more suffering.
Exactly, when that thing inevitably changes or disappears.
He's trying to hold on to a handful of sand.
Yes, the tighter we grip, the more slips through our fingers.
And this clinging fuels the next stage in the chain. Becoming, or bhava.
Right, becoming, in this context, refers to the karmic forces we create
Okay.
through our actions, thoughts, and intentions.
Okay.
These forces shape our future lives and determine the conditions of our rebirth.
So the more we cling, the more we weave the threads of our future suffering.
Exactly, and this weaving is driven by craving and clinging.
Right.
The more we buy into that illusion of a permanent self
Yeah.
and grasp onto things we think will make us happy, the more we perpetuate the cycle.
It's a sobering thought.
It is.
But it's also a reminder that we have the power to shape our own destiny.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Our choices matter, not just in this life, but in the lives to come.
That's powerful. And all of this leads to the final stage in the chain, birth or jatis.
Yes.
But aren't we already born?
Yes, but in the context of the 12 nidanas,
Right.
birth doesn't just refer to the moment we emerge from the womb.
Right.
It refers to the process of taking on a new physical body
Okay.
and entering a new life driven by the karmic momentum from previous lives. It encompasses that whole process of becoming embodied again.
Right. So it's not just the physical act of being born,
Right.
but about starting a new life
Yes.
with all the joys and sorrows that come with it.
Exactly. And with birth comes old age, sickness, and death.
Yeah.
The inevitable cycle of suffering that continues
Right.
until we break free from the chain of causation.
This has been quite a journey.
It has.
We've gone through the entire chain of the 12 nidanas, from ignorance to birth.
We have.
And it's clear this cycle of suffering is deeply ingrained in the human experience.
It is.
But is there hope for escaping it?
Of course, remember, the 12 nidanas aren't just about describing how we get trapped in suffering.
Okay.
They also illuminate the path to liberation.
Okay.
By understanding the causes and conditions that create suffering,
Right.
we can begin to unravel the chain
Yeah.
and cultivate the qualities that lead to freedom.
So it's like a map showing us not only the dangerous terrain,
Yes.
but also the path to safety. That's reassuring. So how do we actually start using this map?
Right.
What are some practical steps we can take to start unwinding this cycle of suffering?
Yeah, that's what I was hoping we'd get to because, we spent the last two parts of this deep dive
Right.
really kind of digging into these 12 nidanas, but I'm ready to see how we can apply these teachings.
Right. Yeah, it's one thing to understand the theory, but the real work begins when we start to embody these teachings.
So where do we even begin?
Yeah.
We've talked about this chain of causation,
Yes.
starting with ignorance, leading to all these formations, craving, clinging,
Right.
and ultimately rebirth. It seems pretty hard to break free from.
It is complex, but the Buddha offered a path, the Eightfold Path,
Right.
that directly addresses each link in the chain.
Okay.
And it all starts with understanding that first link, ignorance, or avidya.
We touched on ignorance before.
Yeah.
I'm still not quite clear on what it means in this context.
Yeah.
It's not just about lacking knowledge,
Yeah.
right? Exactly. Avidya in Buddhism isn't about being unintelligent or uneducated.
Okay.
It's a more fundamental lack of awareness of the true nature of reality.
Okay.
Specifically, it's the ignorance of the Four Noble Truths.
Oh, right. The Four Noble Truths. Remind me what those are again.
So the Four Noble Truths are the foundation of Buddhist teachings.
Okay.
First, the truth of suffering, or dukkha.
Right.
Second, the truth of the cause of suffering, which is craving or attachment.
Okay.
Third, the truth that suffering can cease.
Right.
And finally, the truth of the path to the cessation of suffering.
Which is the Eightfold Path.
Which is the Eightfold Path, exactly.
So avidya is basically not seeing those truths clearly.
Yeah.
Like we're operating under a delusion.
Precisely. And that delusion fuels the entire cycle of the 12 nidanas.
Okay.
It's like we're wearing glasses that distort our perception. We're seeing things as permanent when they're impermanent.
Right.
We see ourselves as separate when we're interconnected.
Right.
And we cling to things that ultimately can't bring us happiness.
So the first step is to take off those glasses.
Exactly. To start seeing reality more clearly.
Okay.
And that's where mindfulness comes in.
Right.
By cultivating present moment awareness of our thoughts, feelings, and sensations.
Yeah.
We begin to see the workings of the 12 nidanas in our own lives.
Right. So we start to notice how that ignorance leads to the formations.
Yes.
Which creates craving and clinging.
Exactly.
Which perpetuates the cycle.
And as that awareness grows, something really interesting happens.
What's that?
We start to realize that we have a choice.
Okay.
We can choose to respond differently.
Okay.
With more wisdom and compassion.
So we can actually break free from that.
But yes, instead of being a puppet controlled by our past conditioning,
Right.
we become more conscious creators of our experience.
And that's where meditation comes in.
Exactly. Through regular meditation practice.
Yeah.
We cultivate the discipline and clarity to see through those illusions.
So meditation is like a training ground for the mind.
Exactly.
It helps us strengthen those muscles of awareness.
We're not just reacting.
It helps us to quiet the chatter of the mind and see more clearly those habitual patterns.
So we can dismantle the illusions.
Exactly. Illusions like the belief in a permanent self.
Right.
The idea that happiness can be found in external things.
Right.
Or the notion that we can control everything. Meditation helps us see the impermanent, interconnected, and selfless nature of reality.
So we're seeing the world through this new lens.
Yes.
That reveals the true nature of things.
Exactly. But it's not just about changing our internal landscape.
Right. We were talking earlier about ethical conduct.
Yes.
How does that fit in?
Ethical conduct is a key part of the Eightfold Path.
Okay.
And a powerful way to weaken the links in the chain of the 12 nidanas.
Okay.
When we act in ways that are aligned with wisdom and compassion,
Right.
we're creating positive karmic momentum.
So it's not enough to just meditate on these things. We
Right.
have to actually live them.
Exactly. Living ethically according to principles of non-harming, honesty, generosity, and kindness.
Creates a more harmonious and compassionate world.
It's a reminder that our actions have consequences.
Absolutely. And those consequences ripple out, impacting not just this life, but future lifetimes as well.
So we're all interconnected.
Yes.
And our choices create a more positive reality for everyone.
Exactly. This has been such an incredible journey.
It really has.
We've explored the 12 nidanas from all angles.
Yeah, we've gone deep.
We've gone deep and uncovered those practical implications.
And that's what I think is so important about this.
Yeah.
Is that it's not just some ancient Buddhist theory.
Right.
It gives us a framework for understanding the human condition.
Absolutely. They show us the causes of suffering, but also the way to liberation.
Right. It's a map.
It is a map.
A guide.
A guide.
A set of tools that we can use
Exactly.
to navigate the challenges of life.
As you continue your exploration of these teachings,
Yeah.
consider how they might shed light on your own experiences.
That's a great point to leave everybody with. I know I'll be chewing on that for a while.
Thank you so much for joining us on this journey.
It's been such a pleasure to dive deep with you.
It has. May your journey be filled with wisdom, compassion, and the liberating insights of the Dharma.